Spitzzeri, Museum Director here at the Homestead. Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to be able to present this last part, 11th part of the history of the Workman and Temple family from 1830 to 1930. And we're calling this the summing up of all parts because we're going to look at the family and what they were doing after 1930 and then giving a summary of their experiences in greater Los Angeles from 1830 to 1930. Before we do that, we want to acknowledge the fact that the family history here extended about 90 years, but that's just a fraction of the stories that were on this site. And so we acknowledge that we are situated on traditional, ancestral, and unceded Gabrieleño, Tongva, and Quiche land. We recognize the indigenous people of this area as the traditional stewards, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to them, their ancestors, elders, relatives, and relations, past, present, and emerging, recognizing their cultural and spiritual connection to this place. So the summing up of all parts is a way for us to, again, kind of close out this family history series, looking at the family after 1930, and as well as summarizing what they were going through during that century. In spring 1930, we look at the fact that the Temple family's financial situation had deteriorated quite significantly. And so what happened was that Walter P. Temple decided to lease the ranch, which was about 92 acres, to the Golden State Military Academy, which came from Redondo Beach to this area. They occupied the property and began to prepare it to be a school for the 1930-31 school year. One of the problems, though, was that as the Great Depression had started the previous fall, there would be an increasing issue with families sending their children to private schools like Golden State. And so a photo here shows the students lined up outside the water tower. To the left of the photograph is the entrance to La Casa Nueva. To the right, behind the water tower, would be the Workman House. In fact, visitors pretty much approach the museum from this vantage point today. On the left is an article from the Los Angeles Times announcing the fact that the school was moving to the ranch in the spring of 30. Photographs here show the students lined up, again, outside of the La Casa Nueva area, and on the bottom in a tennis court on site here. And Golden State had, again, a lease directly with Walter P. Temple. When he lost the place to foreclosure after about 2 years, they remained under a lease with the California Bank, which was the actual owner of the property once the foreclosure took place. And then they wound up moving to Encino in 1935 when their lease expired. The property sat empty for a few years and then became El Encanto Convalescent Hospital, sanitarium as it was called in those days. That was 1940. El Encanto remained on the site until the 1960s when it built a modern facility to the north of us, moved there, and then the City of Industry began to acquire the homestead over a period of time from 1963 until the mid-1970s. Other photos showing the area around La Casa Nueva. The student here, the older student, was actually from Mexico, and we have some scrapbook pages from his short time at the ranch and at the school. So you can see some of the walkways near La Casa Nueva, and on the right, the front door and front entrance. Now, as Walter Temple engaged in that lease, he decided he was going to try to save money and move to the south. Many Americans today live in Baja California. And in 1930, Walter was maybe among the first that did this in the sense of going down to Ensenada and on the coast of Baja California. Now, he had a project that he was already invested in out there. It was a hotel, resort, and casino on the coast there on the beach at Ensenada. He is pictured here on the far right. Next to him is his business manager, Milton Kaufman. At the left is George H. Woodruff, attorney. And all three men were also investors in projects like Temple City and this particular one in Ensenada, which had a famous celebrity as one of its investors, the heavyweight boxing champion, Jack Dempsey. The project did get completed in 1930, but the Great Depression again was underway, and so it did not do particularly well and wound up closing after just several years. And it was one of many examples of projects that Temple was involved in that did not pan out as intended. And that would be the case for a lot of people who are dealing with boom era real estate. And of course, there's going to be the inevitable bust that's going to take place. There's Walter there on one of the porticos looking out from that project. He lived very close by on a street called Ryerson, And at the bottom of the street, he collected his mail. So there was a little place called Husong's Cantina, which became very famous later on. And so he remained in that area for a few years. When he decided to move to Tijuana, that was probably after about 2 years in Ensenada. Then he wound up in San Diego and finally back in Los Angeles. And so he spent his remaining years out there. He occasionally came back to this area while he was living in the South. So the photo on the left shows Walter with a dark suit standing next to Major Lawrence F. Lewis, who was the headmaster of the military academy. Next to Walter on his right is his daughter Agnes, and at the far left, his middle son, Walter P. Temple Jr. And you can also date the photograph to post-1930 because in the upper left corner, the former Sundecks that were there when the Temple family built the house had been enclosed for dormitories for use by the school. The photo on the right just shows Mr. Temple visiting with a family, including his daughter Agnes, who's got the black dress and the white collar in a location probably in Los Angeles somewhere. When he came back to Los Angeles, he had been diagnosed with cancer. And so he lived his last years in the Lincoln Heights neighborhood, northeast of downtown. Did spend time with family also out in what was called Puente, and not La Puente yet. And so the photo on the right shows him with his grandson, Edgar A. Temple Jr. Seeing these photographs from the 30s is a reminder that these were families. Of course, they're going to have events like this, meals, picnics, what have you. And not the kind of same thing you're going to see too much in the 20s because the family was separated quite a bit. Walter's kids were in boarding school, and so they were only home together for summers and occasional other holidays. You might find Agnes Temple, who's seated at the left there, might be home more often. But in the 30s, they could actually be together more often when they had events like this. So Walter's got the black suit with the gray hat on his knee. Next to him with his arm on his shoulder is Thomas, oldest child. Next to Thomas on his right is his wife, Gabriela Quiros. And then, as I said, Agnes with the white coat there on the left, and seated next to her with the white shoes is her brother Edgar, and behind Edgar with a tie is Walter Jr. And of course, the Temple family's financial situation was quite different, with the exception of the daughter Agnes, which we'll talk about momentarily. But again, seeing these photographs is a good way to see how the family was interacting with each other during the 30s. Here's Walter Temple with his son Edgar on the left, on the right with his daughter-in-law Gabriela, and son Walter at the right, and Walter's wife Nellie Didier. Walter P. Temple died in 1938 in November, and so it did get some attention in the newspapers. You see the term pioneer, as well as Temple City founder. And he died just before his oldest son got married. And the idea was that he would be there, of course, for the wedding, but his illness took a very sudden turn, and he passed away just a few days before the wedding took place. Now, the family had requested that Walter be buried at El Campo Santo Cemetery here at the homestead. And California Bank, which was the owner, at the time there was no entity using the property. It was there were caretakers here, but it didn't have a use at that point. The bank said no, they refused burial. So he was interred at the Mission San Gabriel Cemetery, as this photograph shows, and he remained there for over 60 years. In 2002, his granddaughter, Josette Temple, was able to get enough effort together and work with the City of Industry as well as the mission to be able to have her grandfather's remains moved to the homestead. And so we were fortunate enough to have that happen just a little over 20 years ago. As far as the children go, as I mentioned, Agnes Temple did not have the same financial situation as the rest of her family. That's because she married on Thanksgiving Day, 1929, Luis Fajo, who was a descendant of some early families in Northern California. And in fact, he and a cousin were the heirs of a very large ranch, about 48,000 acres, roughly the size of the La Puente Rancho down here. And so he had a substantial amount of money. The family actually owned a large house in San Francisco. Luis was a roommate of Thomas Temple's at Santa Clara University back in the 20s. And so there was that connection already. You see Luis and Agnes before their marriage standing at the front entrance of La Casa Nueva. On the right is a photograph while Luis and Agnes were on a very extensive honeymoon in Europe. So they were married in Thanksgiving 1929, and they didn't come back until the spring of 30. Luis had family in Spain, and so they spent a considerable amount of time with them out there. As I said, Agnes and Luis lived in San Francisco. They had a country place on the ranch, which would be east of Gilroy. Highway 152 runs through that area now. There's a reservoir and dam that encompasses most of the ranch today. And so Agnes had two children, a daughter, Ines, who is still with us in her 90s. And that's Ines as a baby in 1932 on the left there. And then the son was Temple, who died about 20 years ago. And so we were able to form a relationship at the homestead with Temple, or Terry as he was known, and he donated quite a few things to the museum. And then later we got to know his sister quite well as also, and she was able to donate some things to us. So it's always great to have those family connections as things are shared in terms of photographs and documents and what have you. Later years, Agnes with her daughter, and then in her garden, she, like her mother, Laura Gonzalez Temple, had cancer and died in her 50s, early 50s. So Agnes passed away in 1961, the first of the four surviving children. And by surviving, I mean that there was a fifth child who died as a baby back in the early 1900s. But Agnes was the first of her siblings to pass away. Walter Jr. was the middle of the three boys, and he stayed the closest in terms of what happened after 1930. So his father went to Baja California. His sister went to the north. Older brother Thomas wound up in San Gabriel, and younger brother Edgar in Los Angeles for a period of time. But Walter Jr. stayed in this area here in Puene, and he had a girlfriend who worked at the local bank. Her name was Nellie Didier, and they got married in 1934 and had their only child, Josette, a couple of years later. Josette passed away just a couple of years ago and left a substantial donation through her estate to the museum, which has been instrumental in helping us to better understand the family history in recent years. So a few photographs of Walter. That's he and his wife Nellie at their home in Puente with older brother Thomas. And Wally, as he was known, visiting the homestead, sitting on the fountain of La Casa Nueva. And again, you can tell the dating because of the upper left there where the dormitories had been built for the military school. He was the longest lived of the four Temple children. In fact, he was the only one who lived beyond the age of the late 60s. And so Walter was here in 1981 when the Homestead Museum was opened and was a frequent visitor, also loaned and donated quite a bit of material for us to better understand the family history. So the photo on the left shows him sitting in his bedroom with the furniture, much of which he actually donated because he used that back in the 20s. So it was really great to have him. And we also did oral histories on a couple of occasions with Walter Jr., which greatly enriched our understanding of the family history. Youngest son, Edgar, as I said, remained in the area as well, wound up in Los Angeles. He was married first to Rosa Shane, from an early French family here in the San Gabriel Valley. They had one son, Edgar Jr., who did die young in a car accident. He had a few children, however, so we have occasionally had visits from descendants from that line. Edgar wound up working as his older brother Walter did in the aircraft industry during World War II because of obviously the big boom in defense spending for that. And Edgar made a career of working in the aerospace and aircraft industry, wound up spending some time in Oklahoma during the World War II years. And that's where he met his second wife, Hazel Shaw. And Edgar and Hazel had 3 children, 2 of which are still living today. So again, we have close relationships with descendants of the family, as in this case. The oldest child was Thomas Workman II, and we'll spend more time talking about him because he had more of a public role. And that was because after completing his education at Harvard Law School in 1929, rather than pursue law or banking, which was another thing he was considering doing, he indulged himself in his true passion. As he talked about it, he was bitten by the genealogy bug. He had started doing some early research in the 20s as quite a young man, very interested in his family history, as would be natural, but also starting to develop an interest in the history of the area, and especially the Spanish and Mexican eras of California. So on the right is an article in the Los Angeles Times from April 1930, not that long after he returned from school, and about the time that his family is vacating the homestead, where he is speaking on the history of the Workman and Temple families to the Friday Morning Club, which was one of the more exclusive women's clubs in Los Angeles. He settled in San Gabriel. His mother's sister, who was in the Vigore family, owned an adobe house just south of the mission. The building is still there. It goes back to the late 18th century. And so the close ties that the family had with the San Gabriel area, the mission, as well as the city, went back to the 1840s when the family members arrived here from other places. So the photo on the left shows Thomas standing in the intersection very close to the mission. And he's wearing a charro suit, the vest and the trousers, and evocative of 19th century California. In fact, it's almost as if Thomas should have been born in that period of time. He had such an interest in the history of early California. On the right was another early involvement or activity of his as the city of Los Angeles was celebrating its 150th birthday in 1931. He was on a planning committee for that, but he also did some research to try to more strictly define the founding date of the Pueblo. So the document at the bottom, or at least the excerpt from it that is reprinted in that photograph, has a date that says fundado on the 4th of September, 1781. That was supposed to be the founding date of Los Angeles. There's been some question about that over the years, but to this day, the city of Los Angeles still celebrates that as their birthday. Over time, Thomas just continued his in-depth work. He was really the first person to go into systematically the mission records and to transcribe, translate them, and then be able to do genealogy work based on those documents. He had special permission from the bishops of the archdiocese throughout California to do that work. And occasionally you'd find him mentioned in newspapers as a distinguished historian and genealogist of that era. So the article on the left is from the late 1940s. A couple years later, they show him with the postmaster at San Gabriel looking through some of the early census records. He continued doing that work throughout the rest of his life. And he occasionally would work on a book project, wrote some articles, but a lot of what he did was to be commissioned by families to delve into their genealogy. In some cases, he traveled to Mexico. The Orba family of Orange County actually hired him at one point to go to Spain. That was in the middle 1960s. So he had quite an extensive network of people that he was working with. And his genealogical work has been questioned over the years. There are some people who have become a lot more professionalized. He was somewhat of a solo figure in those days. And so there may have been some questions of linking person A to person B that he would have thought was reasonable, but others wouldn't do today because maybe there's just a lack of the required documentation. But there are still people who use his genealogical work. We still get questions at the homestead from time to time from people who have seen charts that he has come up with. Now, his partner in life, as well as in some of the work that he did, was Gabriela Quiros, who was a native of San Gabriel. Her family had been there for a couple of generations. And so they became husband and wife in 1938. But before that, even, the photo on the left is their engagement picture from 1934. And you can see that he's wearing a suit from the 19th century and the cravat, whereas she has on the wedding dress worn by Refugia Martinez, who was the first wife of Thomas's namesake and uncle, Thomas Temple. That dress that she's wearing is from the 1860s. And so they are reflecting in the 1930s, sort of some of the history of their own families and of the region through that. And that continued with the work that they did at San Gabriel Mission. The photo on the right, by the way, is a wedding picture for Thomas and Gabriela, just a few days after Thomas's father, Walter, died. And by the way, that is Edgar, Thomas's brother, standing with them. Among many activities that Thomas and Gabriela had over the years was the Pioneer Reception, which they started in 1934 and continued every year until 1971. And so they had a lot of the founding families or early families of California from the Spanish and Mexican periods forward who would come to these events that were tied into the annual fiestas to celebrate the founding of the mission. So this would be in September each year. On some of these occasions, they had outside dignitaries. So King Juan Carlos of Spain came out in the early 1960s, for example. The photo on the right here shows California's governor, Goodwin Knight, and his wife at the Pioneer Reception of 1958. There were many other events that were held over the years. And so the Temples were deeply involved in many, many activities. And in fact, Thomas was the official historian of the Mission San Gabriel as well as the city for quite a number of years. Article on the left here is one that has an interesting metaphor. Genealogist breaks historical balloons. And what he's talking about is the fact that his work was such that he was, I guess, delving into things that were considered to be new or maybe surprising to some of the families that he was doing work for. It was said that Thomas willed himself to stay alive long enough so that they could celebrate the bicentennial of the Mission San Gabriel, which took place in 1971. He had been diagnosed with cancer a couple of years before. And the fact that he was able to participate in these events in September 1971 and then died just a few months later, again, is part of the fact that he really felt it important to be able to take part in such an important event for San Gabriel. After his passing, family get together here with a framed photograph of Thomas. He had the distinction at the time of being the only layperson buried with the clergy in the courtyard immediately adjacent to the historic stone church at San Gabriel. There has since been another layperson buried there, but for many years, Thomas had an unusual distinction in that sense. Having talked about the Temple family to some extent, we're going to now turn to members of the Workman family after 1930 and some of their involvement as well. And we've talked about Thomas and his deep interest in history and genealogy. That was shared to a certain extent by his cousin, Boyle Workman. Boyle was from a family that's lived in the Boyle Heights community. His grandfather, Andrew Boyle, was a namesake for that area. In fact, Boyle's full name was Andrew Boyle Workman. He was assistant to his father, William Henry Workman, when the elder Workman was mayor of Los Angeles during the boom of the 1880s. This would be 1887 and 88, as well as when William H. was city treasurer from 1901 to 1907. Boyle went on, however, to establish his own mark politically. In 1919, he secured election to the Los Angeles City Council and was immediately selected president and had that position for several years into the mid-1920s. But after 1930, when he had stepped aside from active involvement in politics, he turned more towards his interest in Los Angeles history. So as the article on the right mentions, he would often do that, go to speaking engagements and talk about his recollections of when he was born in the 1860s and shortly afterwards, how different the city was to what it would become in the 1930s and 40s. In fact, some of these articles would talk about the fact that he would be found on the street and someone would walk up to him and he would point out historic landmarks where people live, that sort of thing. He compiled his knowledge in a book called The City That Grew that was published early in 1936. On the left is a review from the Los Angeles Times with an illustration. He also had a partner in the book in terms of the illustrator. Orpha Klinker was a well-known artist of that time. In fact, quite a few years ago, I was summoned out to Pomona to a house where in the garage there were dozens and dozens of Orpha Klinker paintings. The person who had them in their possession was hoping to find a buyer, and the homestead couldn't afford to buy all of those, so they wound up in another location because they had to be sold together. But Orpha Klinker's drawing there or painting of Boyle Workman under a Speaking of Pioneers theme during the time the book was published. And there is Boyle with his four nephews, the four sons of his younger brother Thomas, with The City That Grew as it appeared in 1936. Boyle was also an early member, along with Thomas Temple and other family members, in a group called First Century Families, which formed in 1939. Membership was comprised of people who were descended from those who had settled in Los Angeles between 1781 and 1881. This tended to be mostly elite Anglos. There were a few descendants of Californios at the time. So some of the folks here include Isidore Dockweiler, whose father ran a saloon in Los Angeles under the Temple block, in fact, in the 1870s. But Dockweiler became a very prominent attorney, civic figure, a Roman Catholic layperson in the city of Los Angeles. Mary Foy, third from left. Her father was the owner of the first saddlery and harness shop in Los Angeles. To her left, Susanna Bixby Bryant from a very prominent family in Long Beach and other areas. And then at the end, Boyle Workman and his wife, Frances Whitney, whose father, Robert, was among the founders of the University of Southern California, had been a lawyer, judge, and real estate developer. So the first century families, again, tended to be mostly comprised of members of some of the early Anglo families of Los Angeles. Boyle was also involved in the unveiling of a plaque at Los Angeles City Hall to commemorate the centennial of the arrival of what the plaque says was the Workman-Roland expedition. Now, the family that was on that group was not actually Boyle's direct line. That was his uncle, William Workman, and Nicolasa Urioste, William's wife, and their children who settled here at the homestead. But Boyle did have a tangential connection. And of course, being a former city council president, it seemed obvious to have him partake in the unveiling there in 1941. Plaque is still there, by the way, at City Hall, if you ever want to see that. When he died on Christmas Day, 1942, Boyle was remembered as knowing Los Angeles as few people did. And he did often appear in the newspaper, usually for his birthday, sharing artifacts with his family members. So here, a granddaughter and a nephew, and that sort of thing. So he was one of those figures that tended to be remembered quite a bit in those days because of his connection to a time when Los Angeles was a much different place. But if anything, it was his sister, Mary Julia, who might have had the more diverse portfolio of interests after 1930. And for women in public life, this is a fairly rare thing. We don't see a lot of that going on. It tends to be, again, among the upper elite of Los Angeles, of which she definitely was a part of that. But in any case, she definitely had roles that most women would not engage in. And she was trained as a kindergarten teacher and did that for many years, but she went on to much else. So this is early 1930s work that we're talking about here, where she is urging voters to approve a water bond and also talking about other water issues as well as power. And so these are some examples of some of the civic activities she was involved in. This extended to politics. She was a longtime member of the Democratic Party. So on the left is a 1936 ad for a series of radio speeches being given by prominent figures. Bob Schuler was a minister of quite a bit of notoriety in the 1920s and 1930s. He was called Fighting Bob for a reason. So definitely somebody you should look up if you're not familiar with him. But there's Mary Workman talking about a candidate apparently for district attorney. And so, again, just one example. Years later, she was a supporter of Helen Gahan Douglas, who was a member of the House of Representatives, but running for the United States Senate. And this was a notable election campaign because one of her primary opponents was a guy named Manchester Body, who published a Los Angeles newspaper. His ranch in La Cañada Flint Ridge is now Descanso Gardens, if you know that area. But Body bestowed a nickname on Helen Douglas, which was the Pink Lady. And while she wound up winning the primary, the opponents in the general election picked up on the Pink Lady and used that very effectively. His name was Richard Milhouse Nixon, who wound up winning that election, partly because he was able to paint her as a radical liberal through the Pink Lady moniker. Douglas, though, had some pretty interesting supporters in her campaign for Senate that year. Number one of the dozen listed was Eleanor Roosevelt. Another was the former governor of California, Cuthbert Olson, and then a member of Congress. But at number 8 was Mary McLeod Bethune, a very prominent African-American figure, and Bethune-Cookman University was named for her. Other civic activities that Mary Julia Workman was involved in would be, again, Democratic Party politics, women's forums, women's leagues, giving her support for or against propositions on the ballot during elections. So a few examples of these from basically the 1940s and 1950s. She had a very avid interest, however, in world affairs and foreign relations. And so she was a longtime secretary of the Southern California branch of the League of Nations Association. This is the precursor to the United Nations. When it was formed after World War I, the United States elected to not become a member, which severely weakened the efficiency of the League of Nations, but she continued to be an avid supporter throughout its quarter-century history. So some articles here about her connections to that. The one in the middle is interesting because she weighed in about the invasion of Italy of Ethiopia in the mid-1930s and her concerns about a peace plan that the British and French were proposing for that. On the right was her complaint about a Los Angeles newspaper's characterization of the weakness of the League of Nations and her concern about that, calling the commentary cruel, unfair, and historically incorrect, as well as recalling her own experiences with peace conferences as far back as 1899 and her belief that the League of Nations still had the ability to be successful. This is in the 1940s, and it wound up becoming replaced by the United Nations. In 1940, while the United States was not yet involved in World War II, she was a part of a committee of California chapter or Southern California chapter of the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies. And so she was continuing to have a lot of involvement in activities during World War II. She had always been an advocate for peace movements of various types through the Roman Catholic Church, as well as in other areas. And she, even on the right here, wrote about the fact that feeding people was part of how you develop a peaceful world. On the Roman Catholic side of things, she was a national member of the Catholic Association for International Peace, one of the vice presidents, one of two women at the head of that organization. And she was, again, involved in church-related activities having to do with world affairs, peace, and that sort of thing. I had mentioned before in some of the earlier versions of our presentations on family history that she was the founding president of the Brownson House settlement back in 1901. Settlement houses, such as in Chicago with Hull House and Jane Addams and all that, were very important in terms of things like Americanization programs. Now, we would certainly do these things different now than were done at that time in terms of working with immigrant groups and others in terms of how to become more Americanized. She was leader of the Brownson House for almost 20 years. And when they had the 50th anniversary in 1951, there were articles that showed her with those affiliated with the institution at the time and before. So she was still well remembered for that work. Brownson House does exist in a very different way now than it did back then. Late in her life, she was referred to as Miss Mary, mother to Los Angeles's children. And she was interviewed and talked about the various ways in which she was involved in activities from Brownson House to the utilities, fights, water and electricity that she was involved in, and many other activities. She died in 1964, having spanned a lifetime, when you think about it, from the early 1870s to the mid-1960s. And there are just a couple of easy ways to think about that, transportation from horse-drawn carriages to the space program. The size of Los Angeles from several thousand people to several million, all of those things that she was able to experience in her lifetime. Really a remarkable woman over a long period of time here in Los Angeles. So in summing up, one of the things that we want to try to remember at the Homestead is that over our interpretive period of 1830 to 1930 are the ways that members of the Workman and Temple family were involved in activities that are reflective of what's happening broadly in society. So go back to Jonathan Temple, seated at the right here with his wife, Rafaela Cota, and their son-in-law, Gregorio de Juria, and his involvement in early politics, real estate, and development as a ranchero, as a merchant, all kinds of different ways that he was working in the city of Los Angeles and its environs. The photograph shows his commercial market house building from the late 1850s, designed roughly after Faneuil Hall. And though it failed as the commercial structure, it wound up becoming the Los Angeles County Courthouse in the center of Los Angeles for quite a while. To the left of that is a two-story building with some open windows, and that was a commercial building he built a couple years prior that became the first part of the structure known broadly as the Temple Block. Jonathan was followed about 13 years after his arrival in 1828. His much younger half-brother, 26 years younger, came out to California to introduce himself. And this is Pliny Temple, who took the baptismal name Francisco when he married Margarita Antonia Workman, and Antonia Margarita Workman, and became known as FPF Temple. FPF inherited, by purchase actually, the Temple Block. So on the bottom photograph there, the building at the left side is what Jonathan constructed in the late 1850s, and then FPF, over the course of several years later on, added 3 buildings to the Temple Block. The one facing us, the 3-story structure there, housed the Temple and Workman Bank. That area is now Los Angeles City Hall. And so the relationship between FPF Temple and his father-in-law, William, pictured here with his daughter, is extended to business over time. The Workmans came out the same year that FPF Temple did, 1841. They obtained half of the Rancho La Puente, about 25,000 acres, built an adobe house on it that was retained when additions were made over the years, including what you see here in this 1870 photograph that shows the family posed at the front of the house. And William Workman was a very successful rancher with cattle, horses, sheep, farming as well, wheat and grapes, but plunged into the business area of Los Angeles when the first real boom happened in the late 1860s and into the 1870s, and joining his son-in-law in that. And so one of the leading parts of this will be the creation of the Temple and Workman Bank. There had been a previous partner, Isaiah Hellman, who went on to great success running Wells Fargo and lots of other financial institutions. But Temple and Workman's fateful decision to go on their own wound up ending, unfortunately, in the failure of the institution in 1876, when the boom went bust and Los Angeles experienced its first real large-scale business failure, unfortunately happened to be this bank. Now, while one branch of the family is receding from public activity for the most part after the bank failure, another one is starting to become more ascendant. And so you see the brothers here, Elijah and William H. Workman, who owned a saddlery and harness shop in Los Angeles, did quite well at that, but they were also involved in civic activities. Both of them were on the school board at different times, as well as the Los Angeles Common Council, which we now know as the City Council. Elijah served several terms in each and did a lot of things, including planting some of the early landscape over at the plaza and at what is now Pershing Square. William Henry went to another level. As I mentioned before, he became mayor in the late 1880s and then city treasurer from 1901 to 1907. And then it was William H.'s children, Boyle and Mary Julia, who went on to other activities we've talked about before. Now, the homestead was lost to Lucky Baldwin in the bank failure of the 1870s. Baldwin had loaned money to the bank, and so basically held a mortgage on almost all of the property held by FPF Temple and William Workman. And that did include the homestead here. But once the foreclosure was completed, he did sell 75 acres to Francis W. Temple, one of the grandchildren, who'd been the winemaker for his grandfather Workman. In fact, in the middle of this 1880 map, you can probably make out a wine cellar between the smokehouse, the corn crib, and the barns and all of that. What Francis did in developing this map was to basically show where the Workman house was and the outbuildings, as well as where his occupation was going to be over the next several years. And that's the property towards the bottom and the bottom left. San Jose Creek, you can see a little bit of in the bottom left corner, was essential because it did have water almost year round, and it provided through irrigation the ability to have the orchards and vineyards that are shown in the dollar signs and the little trees there. Francis was fairly successful, actually, in the winemaking and management of the ranch, but he died quite young in the late 1880s. And so the property was turned over to his younger brother, John, pictured here with his wife, 2 children, and father-in-law in front of the Workman house about 1890. John had the misfortune, though, of basically taking over the property when a disease destroyed almost all the vineyards in greater Los Angeles. And then during the 1890s, we had a national depression and 6 years of local drought. So for a farmer, that was particularly devastating. John wound up in some financial distress, borrowed money from a bank, and was not able to pay that loan back, and so was foreclosed upon in 1899. There was an owner of the property in the early 20th century who decided that the cemetery that we had here from the 1850s needed to go. So you can see some of the destruction in the foreground, piles of brick and all of that. Now, that destruction was stopped by a member of the Temple family, Walter, who, unbeknownst to him and everybody else, would wind up owning this about 10 years later. But at least the damage was contained to what you see here. In the background, by the way, you see the Workman house, the water tower off to the left, a hay stacker, and a windmill not too far from the Workman house. There was also a homestead for the Temple family in the Whittier Narrows area, several miles to the west of here. And so FPF Temple's widow, Antonia Margarita Workman, was able to retain 50 acres and family houses and buildings in that location. And so those 2 homesteads existed simultaneously through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Part of the history, too, that's been brought up in previous presentations and is worth summarizing is the rather remarkable story of Josephine Workman. She was a granddaughter of William and Nicolasa Workman from the homestead through their son, Joseph. Josephine was a whistler, that was a performer in theaters when she was a youngster, young teenager, young adult in the early 1900s. She had married a musician and had a daughter. Tragically, both of them passed away within a couple of years of each other at the end of the first decade of the 20th century. And so by the time her daughter passed away, Josephine had already answered an advertisement in a local newspaper looking for an exotic figure for this new thing called film, motion pictures. This is 1909, the year the first movie was shot here in this area. She wound up being hired by a studio and very quickly was transformed into Princess Mona Darkfeather. And while she may have had some indigenous ancestry through her grandmothers, one of whom was from New Mexico, and specifically from the Taos area where there's an Indian pueblo, as well as a grandmother from the west coast of South America, she really was appropriating the identity of an indigenous woman in these films. But she was extremely popular in the first half of the 1910s, wound up making about 70 motion pictures until 1917. I had already talked quite a bit about Boyle and Mary Julia Workman, just a reminder again of following in their father's footsteps of civic involvement politically and socially. And then there's a story of the Temple family here in the 1910s. I had mentioned that Walter sued to have the destruction of the family's El Campo Santo cemetery here at the homestead where our museum is. That was in 1907, just a few years before the photograph on the left was taken. He was living actually at the Temple homestead in Whittier Narrows that he had inherited along with a brother from their mother, and was a teamster, an insurance agent, farmer, and living more or less a middle-class lifestyle. But there was an amazing transformation there as well. And what basically happened was that Walter purchased about 60 acres from the Lucky Baldwin estate. Baldwin, of course, had gotten that land from Walter Temple's father several decades prior. But Walter, who could not pay cash for that land, by the way, so he had to basically pay in installments, moved his family onto the tract, sold off the Temple homestead, and his older child, standing there on the left in that photograph, Thomas, was playing around in the hills with some friends in the spring of 1914 and discovered oil. And so one of the several gushers on what was called the Temple lease is pictured there on the right. And the family went from modest circumstances to having royalties that went upwards of $40,000 or $50,000 a month at one point. And I should emphasize that the average American worker might make $1,500 a year or thereabouts during that time. So it was a pretty amazing and very sudden change in fortune. What was done very quickly after the early oil well royalties were being paid out was the Temples purchased a home in Alhambra, as well as the 75-acre homestead, which they spent a lot of money on over the years. So in the center background is the Workman House. You can see the water tower peeking over one of the wine cellars. That those buildings were there, but were significantly remodeled. So the wine cellars, for example, became an auditorium. That's the larger building. The smaller one to the right was a cafeteria setup. And then you can see a 9-car garage just at the very right edge. And of course, the big project was the building of La Casa Nueva over 5 years between 1922 and 1927. And we are in the middle now of commemorating the centennial of that building over the course of several years. Walter took those oil royalties from Montebello and got involved in his own oil projects, which we've talked about in some of the presentations in this series. He had some success with some of them from time to time, but never was able to replicate the pretty remarkable circumstance of what happened at Montebello. And so all the investment of money to drill oil wells and all that is very heavily front-loaded in terms of your capital. And then he got into real estate as well in many places: Los Angeles, Alhambra, El Monte, San Gabriel, and the founding of the town of Temple, now Temple City, which is also having its centennial commemoration this year. Again, a lot of initial capital investment on that. He had rentals for office buildings and that sort of thing, but the outflow of cash was not really being kept apace in terms of his income. It was just a big imbalance. And so by the late 1920s, he was in some significant trouble. Part of what he tried to do was to take out bonds to finance some of his real estate projects. That was 1926, but it really just extended the inevitable. And when the Great Depression hit, he was unable to continue to try to fight against what was going to be the final culmination of his financial situation, which we talked about earlier, and that was the loss of his properties. Lastly, the homestead in 1932. But that story and the story of the families and their ups and downs over the decades, from as early as the 1870s onwards, is really representative of what can happen in a major developing metropolitan area like Los Angeles, where people take risks. There's a lot of speculation involved in what Walter Temple, his father FPF, and father and grandfather William Workman were doing during their different time periods in this area. So part of our goal, ongoing, since the time we opened in 1981, this is an aerial photograph of the homestead about that time. It was a brand new museum, is to do the best job we can in telling the story of the families in the region from 1830 to 1930, with the understanding that these ups and downs that they experienced are part of the overall situation that you're dealing with in greater Los Angeles society. And so having access to family documents, photographs, letters, papers, and et cetera, which has really accelerated over the years, has been very crucial to that. So a lot of what we showed you today with the photos and other things come from descendants being able to share that with us. And so we're looking forward to continuing to do that work and being able to sum up the story of the Workman and Temple family at any given time with a variety of programs that we have. Speaking of which, we will be starting a new series on the Workman and Temple families, dealing with areas of greater Los Angeles in which they lived and worked. And so we'll be talking about a wide variety of areas in Los Angeles, the San Gabriel Valley, Long Beach, other places. And we'll start in mid-September with a discussion about the San Gabriel area and how the family was involved there from the 1840s to the 1970s. So be sure to join us for that in mid-September. Upcoming programs also include, on the weekend of July 29th and 30th, Monument Memorial Showpiece Home, which is a discussion of La Casa Nueva during its centennial. So be sure to join us for that. We have our book club in early August. There's a series of presentations about the building of America. August 13th, my colleague Jenny Trulock will be talking about, as part of the Female Justice series, Amy Semple McPherson and the alleged kidnapping. She vanished in 1926, was gone for quite a number of weeks. And so Jenny will share the really amazing story of that whole situation with Amy McPherson, one of the most prominent of the evangelical figures of Los Angeles during the 1920s. Sunday, August 20th, we will have a discussion on Sessue Hayakawa, who was a very prominent actor during the 1920s, on a level with Douglas Fairbanks or Charlie Chaplin. Hayakawa was a very rare example of an Asian actor, male or female, who had a very big presence in Hollywood during those years. And although his career waned after that to a very significant extent, he still continued acting. For example, was in The Bridge of the River Kwai in the 1950s. So these diverse programs are something you can sign up for at homesteadmuseum.org/upcoming/events. And please follow us with our handle at Homestead Museum on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future program or event here.